Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Now perhaps like many of you, I jumped into the world of Warhammer long after the squats had become a fond but distant memory. However, I did happen to play with a lot of people who had been around to see them, and through them I got a vicarious glimpse into the squats and why so many people loved and missed them. And in many ways, hearing how they played and some of their lore kind of made me feel that I'd missed out on something special from the early Warhammer fandom. And like Chaos Dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy, I always hoped part of them would come back and bring to life that nostalgic connection for newer players like me, even if it wasn't as a fully fledged Warhammer army. So it's no surprise that the announcement that 40k's version of the Eldar race is returning has got me and thousands of other fans incredibly excited. Yes, we have seen squats, or Leagues of Votann as they're now called, appear in mini releases for Necromunda, but it's not quite the same as what we're getting here for 40k. So in this video I want to talk a little bit more about their return and what I hope to see in terms of model releases when they finally hit the tabletop. So with all that said, let's take a closer look at the latest faction to arrive in Warhammer 40,000, the Leagues of Votann. Now, while Games Workshop has a rather recent knack of calling their 40k and Age of Sigmar factions unique names for copyright reasons, let's not beat around the bush. The Leagues of Votann are space dwarves, and we can see that in practically every part of their aesthetic. They're small, most have beards, they live in secluded communities out in the void, and their lives are an equal blend of strict ancient tradition and powerful archaic technology. And all of that is no surprise when you think about the origins of the squats as an almost literal 40k translation of the Warhammer Fantasy dwarf races, just like how Fantasy Elves became Eldar and so on. But as the Warhammer community mentioned when the Votann were first announced, they are a far more evolved concept than the squats. While the squats were a more literal conversion of high fantasy elements, with the Votann we can see how modern 40k has developed that lore in a much more nuanced way. For example, unlike their predecessors, the Votann are actually made up of myriads of cloned individuals who have been genetically crafted to make them more effective as void travellers, warriors and miners in some of the more hostile parts of the 40k galaxy. And while dwarven technology in Warhammer Fantasy has always been mysterious and a little insane when it came to Malachi Macasson's Goblin Hewer, the abundant use of sentient automatons by the Votann touches on some of the more curious and terrifying aspects of the setting, particularly given AI's role in the fall of humanity's old empire before the Horus Heresy. So when it comes to just the lore, the Votann are certainly going to offer a lot to older and newer players alike, which is exactly what many of us were hoping for. But in addition, we're also beginning to see some really interesting models, such as the Hernkian Pioneer and the Vartigan Exodriller. Again, we're seeing things that are distinctly and deliberately evolutions of the squats, but with a heap of modern 40k, and that really does get me excited to think about what else we could see down the line, given what we've also seen from other factions lately. So that's probably as good a point as any to ask the question, what might we expect to see from the new Leagues of Votann range? Well, here's a few of my ideas. We've seen from some of the new artwork that despite being clones, there does seem to be some semblance of hierarchy amongst the Votann, and that shouldn't be surprising given when we think about all of the dwarf lords and kings that brought order to the dwarf kingdoms in Warhammer Fantasy. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we find out in their lore that some of the genetic variation allows for kin that are more suited for leadership and the sort of decision making you need when you're trying to keep a dying race going in such a hostile galaxy. However, it's pretty clear that when you're only a few feet tall, going up against some of the more hostile enemies might seem, and excuse the pun, a bit of a tall order. For example, by the time the Votann have seen anything close to a full release, you'll likely have 3 demon primarchs running around and all manner of terrifying beasts and monstrous heroes, and simply put, you want the leader of your league to look like more than just a glorified speed bump when going toe to toe with them. So thinking back to those dwarf lords and kings in Warhammer Fantasy, from which a lot of inspiration might be drawn, I wonder if we might see Votann heroes accompanied by dedicated bodyguard retinues. Looking at the artwork from one of the earlier Warhammer community posts, you can see these 2 warriors standing behind the leader and wearing a much bulkier version of their armour with the higher backplate and shoulder guards, giving them the semblance of Space Marine Terminators. We can also see these other warriors on the far side of the hologram wearing similar armour to the other 2, but yet seeming slightly taller. Could this be a different variation of armour, or simply a taller member of the Votann? Whatever the case, I do sense that these two are at least watching over the leader rather than the hologram, and that implies that we could see heavily armoured bodyguard retinues accompanying our heroes as they stride across the battlefield, and that is going to be something really fun when it comes to collecting the models and playing on the tabletop. The Warhammer community team also dropped some interesting hints when it came to psykers in the leagues. In essence, they have such a craft over their genetic makeup that they don't suffer from the same scourge of psychic mutation that other humans do. In fact, to use psychic powers requires a specific clone skin, which they at least use for traversing the warp. Now, in my mind, that begs the question of what Votann psykers, or should I say non-psykers, will look like. In Warhammer Fantasy, dwarves had nothing to do with magical warpcraft, seeing it as something foul and linked to chaos, so instead they relied on the incantations of their runesmiths to nullify their enemies' magical abilities, bless their own war gear and smite their foes. I expect we'll see something similar from a Votann hero, a character who can dampen the abilities of other enemy psykers. In fact, given how all Votann kin are said to have souls that shine less brightly than others in the warp, I can even expect that all units might have a slight resistance to warpcraft, but that a specialist hero might have a greater ability to affect psykers, perhaps like blanks in the Imperium. That could make for some other interesting abilities, like weakening the resolve and leadership of enemy psykers they get close to, or perhaps doing extra damage to demonic units. Either way, I think there's something more to the way Votann souls operate, and a hero character could be a great way to explore that. Changing the focus slightly, we know that the mainstay unit of the Votann, the Hearthkin Warriors, can form units of up to 20 models, and that's pretty good given the stat line they have. They're stout, they're tough, as they should be, but with only one wound, having a few of them is really going to help. However, with a movement of only 5 inches, you don't want them slogging their way up the battlefield, particularly when you're trying to seize objectives all across the board. No, ideally you want them to ride in style, and so that raises the question of what transport options the Votann might employ. Well, in my view, when you're a race of prospectors and miners, the only sensible way to turn up is from underground, and that calls for drill transports. We've already seen underground transports in Warhammer 40k in the form of the Terrax pattern Termite Assault Drill, and without labouring the point, this is exactly what I want to see from the Votann range. Again, their profession is mainly mining and prospecting, so you can imagine how they might use these transports to get workers deep into the earth, but also to help deal with any surprising threats they find down there, likely Necrons. As such, they can also use those vehicles to undermine their foes on the surface, breaching fortifications and appearing in the midst of the enemy force to wreak havoc up close and personal. And with a mix of bolt gun and ancient earth weaponry, you can imagine how messy that might get. Of course, if you're going to be appearing in the midst of your enemy, one of the better weapons to be carrying is certainly a big flamer, and the affinity that the dwarves of Warhammer Fantasy had to flame weaponry makes me think that we might see at least one flame specialist unit in the Votann roster. In fact, if you've played Warhammer Total War, you'll probably know about the Dwarven Iron Drakes, small units of heavily armoured dwarves wielding flamethrowers called Drake Guns that can bathe the enemy in alchemical fire, torching dozens with every well-timed volley. I think that's a unit that will not only be great to see in the Leagues of Votann, but in 40k in general, and it could give the former a few extra options when it comes to dealing with horde and model intense armies like Tyranids and Imperial Guard. And once again, if you're spending a lot of time in mines and the close confines of prospector sites, you can see why a flamer could come in handy. Of course, given their almost ancient connections to humanity, we're bound to see some other interesting weapons in their arsenal, but I have a personal love for what the dwarves did with the Iron Drakes and Flame Cannons, and I hope we get some flavour of that with their 40k descendants. And finally, I can't help but take notice of some of the older epic models that the Warhammer community team mentioned in their article on the saga of the squads. They specifically talked about their lack of titans and how they made up for it with their incredible inventions such as gyrocopters, armoured dirigibles, enormous siege weapons, and of course, the land train. Now, I for one would love to see the land train make a return, but at the same time, I think it's probably a safer bet to think that there'll be at least one artillery or heavy tank model joining the faction. That's because even though I've mentioned transports, the Votann will also benefit from a more defensive style of play, with battle line units holding the objectives they can reach, while ordnance rains down on the ones they can't. And given how pretty much every other faction has some long range artillery, I can't see the tech savvy Votann skipping on the big guns. But what might that look like? Well, while they might not be the size of the Cyclops with its anti-Titan cannon, we could see something similar to a heavy Basilisk or Baneblade, perhaps bearing ancient pre-heresy weaponry and using it to rip apart knights and hordes in equal measure. And given that the Kratos heavy assault tank is now making its way into 40k, I can see the return of something similar to the squat Colossus mobile fortress, bristling with pre-heresy STC weaponry and maybe a decent troop capacity to boot. In fact, given how much ancient information the Votann have collected, we may even see a few other Horus Heresy vehicles make an appearance over time, albeit in new variations that point to their original STC technology. But overall, I think a heavy tank or artillery unit akin to the Colossus Mobile Fortress or Goliath Mega Cannon is bound to offer Votann players more tactical options on the tabletop, while also tapping into that nostalgia for the squats that really has carried us through the decades and brought us up to this point. So that's just a few of my personal expectations on what might be coming with the new Leagues of Votann. But what are you hoping to see? Also, if you happen to play when squats were around, what other inspirations do you think Games Workshop might draw on when it comes to fleshing out the Votann range? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, I want to say a big thank you for watching today. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And I do hope you'll join me for my next one. Until then though, do take care.